The weekly Cybercrime and Business Podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact to their business, and proactively address threats head-on. Hey everybody out there, today is April 3rd, 2015. I am Jeff Peters, HackSurfer editor. I'm here with Matt Lightfist, HackSurfer writer, and Eric Severson, Surfwatch Labs data analyst. A little bit later after our discussion, we have an interview with John Zurawski. He's the VP of Authentify, and we chatted about call center fraud and stuff that's been going on, like with Apple Pay. But yeah, I guess I'll get right into it. Throw it over to you, Matt, for the top headlines of the week.
Coming in at number 3 this week, we had the Endurance Group, and this is a company that owns several web hosting sites. So we have JustHost, HostMonster, HostGator, FastDomain, and Bluehost. After months of silence, the Syrian Electronic Army decided, hey, it's time to attack somebody. They decided to attack the Endurance Group due to the fact that they were hosting terrorist websites. At least that's what the Syrian Electronic Army tweeted. SEA warned Endurance Group that if they were caught doing this again, that the next time they would change their DNS settings. Coming in at number 2, we had Baidu. This is a very popular Chinese search engine, and it played a key role in the GitHub DDoS attack, which was the number 1 trending target for the week. The Chinese government is allegedly injecting malicious JavaScript code into websites that serve advertisements and tracking code from Baidu, which turned normal users' web browsers into denial-of-service tools. And this ultimately resulted in a massive flood of traffic on the GitHub website. So that would be the DDoS attack. And then number 1, we have Slack Technologies. They were breached in February. The attack lasted several days. Usernames, email addresses, and passwords were leaked. The company said that they would be implementing new security upgrades, such as two-factor authentication to their networks. And this, we've talked about this before. It brings to light how unprepared some of these companies are dealing with cybercrime. Not that two-factor authentication would have completely mitigated or thwarted the attack, but, you should probably have that in there already. But getting back to the previous points, guys, we're talking... with Baidu, we're talking state-sponsored attacks. I mentioned Syrian Electronic Army, that's hacktivism. We've seen a lot of this going on recently. This month is no exception. So I thought maybe we could start the conversation there.
Yeah, I guess that's really what stood out to me is there's just been a lot of these sort of ideological attacks in the news. A couple weeks ago we were talking about ISIS basically just defacing sites all over the globe, all the low-hanging fruit that they could find. And then, obviously we got the Syrian Electronic Army coming back. We got this Chinese, basically DDoS attack. And the Electronic Frontier Foundation, I was reading their blog post about it this morning. And, they said that these attacks were a deep violation of the basic trust that allows the internet to function smoothly and a disquieting and unprecedented development in the history of state-orchestrated denial-of-service attacks. So, obviously that's pretty strong statement from them. So, we have that happening with China. I was reading another story. Iran has increased their cybersecurity spending 12-fold since 2013. And that kind of ties in with some of the people we've interviewed here, just talking about, there's going to be a lot more of these players, whether they're hacktivist groups or state-sponsored groups, kind of jumping into the fray in the coming years. And yeah, Matt, I know you wrote a story about another group that was doing some stuff, Vikingdom 2015, I think is their Twitter handle. I don't know if you want to fill us in on them a little bit. Yeah,
they're a newer group. They've also, a lot like ISIS, they attack a lot of that low hanging fruit, in an effort to really become, people to really know who they are. What was interesting about this group, and on Surfwatch, I should point out that we've seen them tied to about 11 targets this year, according to Surfwatch Labs data. The interesting about this group, Encapsula actually did a study. They had a customer that was suffering a DDoS attacks from Vikingdom 2015, and they were able to measure the attack. There were representatives from this hacktivist group going on record saying that their attacks were reaching like a level of like 3.5 terabits per second, and that wasn't even close to being the case. And I'd have to look it up, guys, but Encapsula saw it come in at much, much smaller than that. So they're out there. They are being effective, but they're not really a huge player yet in the field either. Their capabilities don't seem to be on par with some other groups.
Yeah, and that number was at 8.74 gigabytes was the attack, according to Encapsula anyways. They said, from our viewpoint, it looks like this group executes small-scale attacks against high-profile, low-hanging fruit, all in the effort to achieve that ever-so-flimsy instant internet notoriety. That's kind of their little way of poking fun at them, I think.
There's some of the ideology coming from the other direction, too. Anonymous has been targeting ISIS Twitter accounts. And then, of course, domestically, they've got the Indiana religious freedom law situation, some government sites under attack, some businesses being targeted for participating in what they call discriminatory practices. So all kinds of things happening.
Yeah, not to go too far down that rabbit hole with the Indiana law, but there's an article on CSO Online which I thought was pretty interesting. There was a pizzeria quoted on a local ABC station, basically saying that they're a Christian establishment, and that kind of ended up making national headlines, and they ended up getting thousands of, or over 1,000 negative Yelp reviews and all these phone calls ordering pizzas. And I actually just saw this morning, it said that the owners of Memories Pizza have actually closed the store due to the backlash from their support over that. And I thought that was kind of interesting as well, because in reading this update from CSO Online, it says that, they didn't even actually necessarily come out in support of it, like on their own. A reporter from ABC 57 was actually responsible for the story, and, she walked into their shop out of the blue just to ask them how they felt about the law. So it seems like, regardless of what you think, it's just kind of, it strikes me that, a reporter just kind of asked them an offhand question, and the next thing you know, they're going out of business due to, the way things travel on the internet nowadays.
Yeah, it's amazing. It seems like you really, in a situation like that, depending, it doesn't matter how you look at it, you got to watch what you say because everyone's listening, apparently.
Yeah, and then another story that I thought was pretty interesting, I saw this article from the Harvard Business Review titled "Why Data Breaches Don't Hurt Stock Prices." I thought that was interesting just because that's something we've talked about in the past, and I know that it's a question a lot of people have. You see these big companies getting these headlines, but then you look at their stock price and it's higher than it's ever been. Basically, the premise from them was that they were saying that there's really no way to measure the impact of these breaches, and that shareholders really need more information and tools in order to do so. They said this mismatch between the stock price and the medium and long-term impact on companies' profitability should be addressed through better data. Shareholders still don't have good metrics, tools, and approaches to measure the impact of cyber attacks on business and translate that into a dollar value. Most of the time when people talk about the stock prices, they just say, everyone's used to data breaches. And they were kind of taking the position that potentially it could impact stock prices more. It's just we don't really have the tools and the data necessarily to make those decisions yet.
There was a study that was pretty closely related that said Target's total bill for their data breach was about $252 million, which is a big number. But then they have insurance coverage that cuts that down, some tax deductions. Total, it's $105 million that they're out of pocket. Which again is a big number, but that's 0.1% of their yearly revenue. Similar for Home Depot, but they got theirs down to 0.01% of their yearly revenue. So it's really not hitting the bottom line. Though I think some of the interesting stuff is the intangibles and some of the future results. Target settled their class action suit, but they still have a suit coming up from the banks with the financial institutions that took most of the hit suing them, and we'll see what that effect might have. And then there's the bigger stuff. Can these companies be trusted? Which is, again, pretty intangible. And the future, as of October, the liability for non-EMV breaches is supposed to shift from banks to companies. And that could really affect how much these big retailers are spending on data breaches if they occur. Of course, the retailers have lobbied to get the EMV deadline moved from October 2015 to 2016 after the holidays. So they're trying to avoid that level of responsibility for as long as they can.
Yeah, so I guess moving on, is there any other interesting things that stood out this week?
I want to reference the Slack breach and, bring to light again. Now, Slack was a startup. It's a newer startup company, but we've seen this before. You have breaches, and you can probably count, out of every, this isn't an official statistic, but it just seems like with a lot of these breaches, companies breached. Now we're going to implement upgraded security. Hindsight being 2020, it's easy to sit here and say, you should have done that in the first place. But with the frequency of cyber attacks, that have been happening for years, I don't know if they're just like ignoring the fact or they're just, taking a pray method, saying it won't happen to me, but they're just seemingly unprepared a lot. And one thing, I wrote an article this week, I talked about the Slack breach and the frequency of cybercrime. I did some digging, and I found this article that actually broke down a lot of the costs for some of this technology. And just as an example, there was one company that was offering a service that did a lot more than two-factor authentication. It offered like 4 different services all tied into one. And the cost was $8 per user. One thing you could bring up with that is that if a company had several thousand users, that bill gets significantly higher. But a lot of these companies that have all of these users, as we've seen, let's take Target, for example. Eric just got done saying that they were on the hook for $105 million for their data breach, but that only accounted for like 0.1% of their revenue for the year. That should be a drop in the bucket for a lot of these companies, and this is just one example. So I just, for me, I'm on this quest to try to understand why companies are just avoiding, in my opinion, cybersecurity in general. That's what it seems like to me.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is just, from the people that I've spoken to, is especially with like a startup like Slack, a lot of times security, I think, gets put on the back burner. They want to get out to market as fast as possible, and you want to do more of the customer-focused features. And so I think that's just kind of the nature of the way things get developed now is, there's such a rush to get everything out. I saw an article just recently talking about how that's a big problem with app security as well. People are in such a rush to get these apps out that a lot of times security sort of goes by the wayside.
Yeah, speed is a huge factor. Like, if you don't get your service online, someone else probably will, and they'll neglect their security to launch faster. So you just kind of this race to the bottom security-wise that doesn't resolve itself until someone gets majorly hacked, and then it's too late.
Yeah, so moving on to the cyber tip of the week, there was another story about an espionage campaign called Volatile Cedar. Security firm Checkpoint uncovered what they called the first important example of a well-resourced, long-running, and successful cyber surveillance campaign carried out by a Middle Eastern group. But basically the group was targeting Western targets in the defense and military sectors. But what was interesting is that instead of focusing on spear phishing attacks or 0 days or drive-by downloads, things like that, what they did was they were focusing on vulnerable web servers. And Checkpoint says that they believe that this represents a vulnerability that is underestimated by today's security world. Shahar Tal, he was one of the 2 researchers at Checkpoint that discovered this campaign. And he said that people don't necessarily segment their networks to protect internal servers, and that he thinks that they're going to see more of this if we haven't already. Because he says it's an effective choice in using web servers as a stealthy attack vector. So that's just something to keep in mind. All right, moving on. Now we have our interview with John Zurawski. He's the VP of Authentify, and we talk about Apple Pay and call center fraud. Yeah, I guess to get started, I know Apple Pay was in the news a bit recently. You know, people were saying that there's rampant fraud going on in there. I don't know if you followed that story too closely, but wondering maybe if you could kind of explain what was happening to the listeners out there with that.
Sure. The fraud that was biting Apple Pay is very, very similar to the fraud that was biting banks that went online in the very early, 03, 04, 2003, 2004 time period. The registration process was not particularly well thought out, or even if it was well thought out, the mischief makers figured out how to beat it. So what the cyber fraudsters discovered was that they could actually get a Apple iPhone. They're already set up for Apple Pay in someone else's name. So they call a call center somewhere and say, hey, my name is Jeff Peters, and I have this credit card and this credit card number, and I'd like to activate my new phone for Apple Pay. So they could buy the credit card information, they could buy, the user identity information, off Tor, on the deep internet, and then, basically call, a bank and say, I'd like to use, your Apple Pay. I'd like to activate my phone for Apple Pay with this card, because the bank would have no way of knowing, oh, well, this must be your new iPhone number. Apple wasn't matching up, that information, all that well for the bank. So typically they'd get a hold of someone at the call center, and the person at the call center's job is to try and help. So they'd go through some knowledge-based authentication, likely information, the fraudster had already mined from somewhere, and the fraudster would get a fresh Apple Pay account. And, the fraudsters share this information as well. Like, hey, I've found out that I can get, a purloined Apple Pay account by doing this. Now, they have to be good at gaming, the call center, do a little social engineering. But at conferences like Black Hat and DEF CON, they actually have social engineering contests where a group of contestants will be in sound booths and they'll see who can game, an administrative password, out of a company the fastest. And, it's usually a matter of minutes before, the game is over. Somebody has an administrative password, an administrative user account and password, for a network account at some fairly, famous companies for that matter. And that is a problem, at the call center for a lot of different types of fraud. Online, there are tools that an organization can use behind the scenes. They can do, IP address matching, cookies, device fingerprinting, geolocation against your IP address, launch a second factor, a telephone call or SMS to a phone to make sure you can answer that phone. So there are tools available in the online channel that just aren't available, to a call center service representative.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about, say like some of those tools, because it seems to me, like I was reading the New York Times article from a couple weeks ago about the Apple Pay fraud, and basically, Apple wanted it to be as frictionless as possible, so they're not requiring a lot of information. And it said that some of the bank executives were fearful of asking for more because they didn't want to be excluded. So it just seems like with all these sort of fraud and cybercrime stories, it seems like the financial sector is always sort of acting from a sort of convenient standpoint. So it almost seems like they're intentionally, maybe not doing the stuff that they could do. I don't know if you agree with that.
Well, I think it's always been a battle between user convenience and, security of the process. And whenever there's a turf war, and the market for banking services and credit card services in the United States, is getting reasonably saturated. So the only way to get new customers is to take someone else's customers. The population growth has been fairly steady. So the advance of customers, they're 12, 13, 14, 15 years old, they're going to be 18 years old, hasn't been that rapid or that large. So typically the only way to get, your user base bigger is to take someone else's. So if you're a marketing person, you're probably thinking, if it's, 10% harder to do something with me than the other guy is going to get the business. Relative to security, this is my own personal opinion. I can't back this up, with a lot of data yet. But in my opinion, I believe we're reaching a tipping point, particularly with, millennials and, boomers and stuff like that, where they're beginning to understand the dangers and they're willing to trade a little inconvenience for a little more security. And I think we'll probably see, more end user authentication where they have to interactively answer a phone, return a text message, go answer an email, something like that, going forward. So typically it's a registration process. Everybody wants to sign you up in a hurry and make it real easy. And the mischief makers figure out how to take advantage of that.
One of the stats that you guys sent over, it kind of surprised me. It said 30% of banking fraud begins in call centers. I just thought that was kind of a surprising amount, because I guess typically, you don't really think of call centers. You think, more like the online stuff or point of sale stuff. Obviously, you're talking about how they are doing stuff, but still, that's still a pretty significant number. So, what else do they need to do? Or is this just kind of the way it's going to be, where, there's going to be that huge percentage of fraud that starts there?
The statistic was actually from a vice president at a bank who said that 30% of their fraud originated in the call center. He didn't give any statistics relative to dollars and cents. Once this fraud got started, did that mean 30% of the loss, or 30% of the total dollars, but 30% of it was the call center was the point of origination. And if you think about it for a moment, that sort of makes sense, because the more opportunistic and the less technically proficient can still game a call center person. I can go online, I can buy credit card information, name and address information, and I'll have an idea who your bank is. Now, I don't have to do any hacking to do that. I don't have to do any, build a virus or release any advanced persistent threat. I can, just do that the same way I'd buy something from Amazon if I know where to go looking for that information. Once I'm armed with that information, I can call the call center. And, now I'm just using my voice and my charm, if you will, to either get someone to reset the password for a particular account or issue me a new credit card. Oh my gosh, I'm traveling. I've lost my credit card. Can you send me a new card? And a call center person, they're trained to help. So, if you answer some of the right questions, what's your mother's maiden name? When were you born? What's the mascot at your high school? And, the mischief makers and cyber fraudsters are not dumb. if they have your address, they can certainly find you on Facebook, cast about your neighborhood, and figure out that, oh, this guy seems to have grown up right in that area. Here are some of his friends, and they could figure out which high schools you might have all in common. You probably on LinkedIn or Facebook might even say what college you went to. So they can mine a lot of information about you anyway, probably enough to convince a call center person that in fact you are who you're pretending to be, and get them to mail out a new credit card or reset your password for you. And that's part of the challenge. The person who's charged with helping you doesn't have that many tools at their disposal. Now, slowly but surely, that's starting to change. More places are beginning to put voice biometrics in line with incoming calls, and so you have to voice authenticate. We've developed a way for a mobile user, to use a bank's mobile app and authenticate to the mobile app, push a button, and then be connected to the call center, so that the person in the call center understands that, oh, this person has managed to successfully authenticate themselves to their copy of our mobile app, so I trust that, this is Jeff Peters. So the tools are coming. It's just how quickly we can get, financial organizations to adopt them.
Yeah, that was something I wanted to ask you, because I guess, from an outsider's perspective, you think of a bank, you think of a financial institution, you just assume that they're pretty advanced with their cybersecurity. But I was speaking to another vendor that did authentication stuff about a month ago, and he said that what really surprised him was 60% of their customers were sort of green. They never had strong authentication to begin with, even though they were dealing with, a lot of big financial customers, he said. So I'm just wanted to get your kind of perspective on that. Is, obviously you guys deal with multi-factor authentication. Do you find that a lot of financial institutions aren't even using that kind of security?
I'm certainly familiar. We have 1,200 financial institutions as clients, and I'm familiar, with some of their security practices. And I can say that there's certainly a lot more than meets the eye when you, just show up and use your bank account. And some of the financial institutions are pushing, authentication a little deeper into the session. So you might just log in with a username and password, which seems very easy. But then as soon as you try and add a payee to an e-payments account, or if you start to make a payment to someone or some entity that, you've never paid before, perhaps they ask, hey, listen, these are the telephone numbers we trust for you. Here's your home, here's your work, here's your mobile. Which one of these phones can you answer? Or if I've, stolen your username and password, and now I've logged into your account and I'm going to try and change your telephone number on your account or something like that, you get stopped. And it's okay, in order to change that telephone number, you're going to have to answer one of these other ones or accept an email at this email address. So I think the banks have gotten better. I think the mischief makers and cyber fraudsters have gotten better. So it's, this is, with each advance in security and with each advance in technology, the mischief makers, have their opportunity, to try and thwart that. So it's an arms race, and it's an arms race. I'm pretty confident that if you were to research this, you'd find out that the Egyptians were the ones who invented a door lock and key. And part of that was to protect the riches that a pharaoh would get buried with. And typically it was to protect the tombs from being looted. And, the tomb raiders figured out how to defeat the door lock and key, and, different mechanisms, the maze interior of the pyramids, fake walls, hidden booby traps and things like that were all part of what the Egyptians would build into a tomb to try and protect, what was entombed there. And, slowly but surely the mischief makers figured out how to thwart those. So, this battle between, those with things they want to protect and those, who want to take those things from them, has gone on for thousands of years. It'll probably go on, for another thousands of years.
That's it for this week's Cybercrime and Business Podcast. As always, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, YouTube, Podbean, or wherever else you listen. And for more information, check out hacksurfer.com and surfwatchlabs.com.